So our final speaker is Robert Haas. Bob has been in the business for over 56 years now. He started out in 1950 working retail with his father. It was in 1973 that he began Vineyard Brands, extremely well-known company, import company, and as you all know, that thrived. He has friends in the business all over the world, and he partnered with some of them, the Perron family, to start, and other partners, to start Tablas Creek about 1990. He's extremely well recognized in the wine community, and I think that he really needs no further introduction, except that I want all of us to give him a warm welcome and thank him very much for taking the time to be with us today. Bob Haas.
Thank you, Deborah. Being the anchor person, I have the opportunity to comment on other people's comments. I'd like to sort of go back to Remington's evocation of terroir. Terroir is probably one of the more difficult and most understood terms that keeps bandying or getting bandied around in this business. To begin with, and I'll give you my definition, but to begin with, there is no such thing as terroir without wine. There are, a terroir is described by the wine it's produced, by the wine it produces. And to me, there are sort of three legs on which the terroir stool stands. One is the terrain, or the soils. The other is the climate, which are, certainly the terrain is fairly perennial. That doesn't change. And the climate is more or less similar, although it does change from year to year, more in the European vineyards than it does in California, but it certainly changes in California enough to make sensible differences between vintages. And the third leg on which terroir stands is the hand of man. He decides what varieties or what cultivars he's going to plant. He decides on how dense the vineyard's going to be. He decides on a whole bunch of factors that go into the product that comes out at the other end. So those are the three things. In the old world, in Europe, there has been 2,000 years of growing, 1,000 years of tradition of what, not experience, I guess I should say, rather than tradition, of what to plant where. And in France, and to a lesser extent in Italy, and also in Spain, these conditions of planting and the areas to be planted are controlled by law. And therefore, there are restrictions on what you can plant in Burgundy or in Châteauneuf-du-Pape or in the Côte du Rhône or in many other Appellation contrôlées. In our AVA system, they're basically geographic descriptions that do somewhat describe different cultivation areas and climates, but very indistinctly, in my opinion, and then the fact that you can then plant whatever you want, wherever you want, within that area, sort of, it's not the same thing as Appellation contrôlée. We have total freedom to do whatever we want, to plant where we want, what we want, to harvest it when we want, to determine the density of plantation, to irrigate, not to irrigate. All those things are totally free, and we're free to blend as we wish between one variety and another. In Europe, in France, that's very restricted. In Châteauneuf-du-Pape, they have 13 varieties, but it's 13 specific varieties. In Burgundy, they have one variety for red and one variety for white. So there's a whole spectrum of what people can do. The ironic thing about it is that the restrictive system in Europe or in France has maintained a diversity of plantation so that there are many varieties that are planted throughout France. Whereas here in the United States, where we have total freedom, we've been so market driven that the tunnel gets narrower and narrower and narrower and narrower as we go along. And there have been in the past, recently, just one or two or three or four varieties, as Remington was alluding. One of our objectives, our mission at Tablas Creek is to plant varieties that are suitable for our climate and to try to encourage other people to experiment with other varieties and to broaden the spectrum of grapes being planted in California. And but we still do it with certain conditions. When we went searching for our property, we were looking for soils with a pH of 8.5 because we wanted to match the pHs of the soils at Château de Beaucastel. And we knew we wanted to plant Rhône varieties, so we brought the material in from France, went through the USDA. Unfortunately, California was closed at the time because Austin Goheen had retired and Deborah had not yet taken over the job of bringing in and indexing material from abroad. So we brought it through Geneva, New York, where the USDA station was kind enough to take care of what our needs were, but they didn't have a lot of room, so it took us 4 or 5 years to bring in all the material we wanted, and it's just some material each year, so we didn't get all of our material in until I think until 2002, I guess, was the last material we brought, and we started bringing in 1990. And we started with the 3 years of indexing and then multiplication necessary and grafting. We didn't really get much vineyard in the ground until 1996. And now we've got about 95 acres planted. We have another 30 to go. We're going to plant 5 a year until we are planted up, and our eventual production limit will be about 22,000 cases. And since it's all estate bottled, we don't buy any fruit. That will be the limit at which we'll settle. One more comment, and then we'll start tasting. Climate was something that was discussed by Glenn, and somebody asked me a question just before. What is our heat summation compared to Château de Beaucastel? And I've got to tell you, I don't have the vaguest idea, because I don't think heat summation or degree days is totally, doesn't really describe the climate. And I can give you a perfect example. When we were bringing in our own material, Bryce Jones at Sonoma-Cutrer asked us to bring in clone 548 of Chardonnay. And we brought in enough material. We ended up planting 2.5 acres of Chardonnay in order to give Bryce the 70,000 buds that he was looking for. And eventually we were going to graft it over, but we made some wine with it. We kind of liked it. So we kept it, and we're still making wine out of those 2.5 acres, which we don't put on the market, but we sell just for our tasting room or to our wine club. And so we have the same clone growing at Tablas Creek as they have growing in the Russian River Valley at Sonoma-Cutrer. And every year we get later bud break and later harvest than they do. And they're a region 1 and we're supposed to be a region 4. So, I think that the answer is it's not only a question of how many degree days there are over such a temperature, but how many minus degree days there are at nighttime. because our nights are, we have a 50-degree variation, diurnal variation between night and day. And those cold nights slow down the maturation and keep the acidity in the grapes that makes our climate. So I think you have to look at what the maturation of the grapes if you're looking at a climate, and see how that works. And we started with the idea that this was going to be a hot climate. We were going to limit our whites because of that, because the word was, gosh, you can't make good white wines in Paso Robles, it's too hot. And we discovered that you can make good white wines in Paso Robles. And so we originally were planning to be about 25% white, and I think now we're about 35%. And I think as we plant the next 20 acres or 25 acres, we're going to go all to red, so we'll drop back down a little. But white wines have been a revelation to us. So the only other thing I can say is that as inspired by Beaucastel, we farm organically. Everything's estate bottled. Our vinification is pretty straightforward. Whole cluster press on the whites, destem but don't crush the reds. Pump over some Syrah and Grenache we tend to like to punch down. We use indigenous yeast. Otherwise, and the density of planting is somewhere between 1,400 and 1,800 vines an acre, depending on whether we need to terrace. If we need to terrace, obviously we need a slightly lower density. So let's go. One thing about the wines. There's one wine that we're going to taste that is not on your list here. It's the Côte de Tablas Blanc, and it is a 2004 vintage. The Côte de Tablas Blanc is there to replace both Marsanne and Viognier, which is part of the blend, of which we did not have the single variety. They had already been blended in, so we did not have the single varieties available. So the first one we're going to taste is the Côte de Tablas Blanc, which is 55% Viognier and 29% Marsanne, and 8% Grenache Blanc and 8% Roussanne. Did I say Grenache Blanc? We do have Grenache Blanc. What we don't have is Marsanne. So it's Viognier and Marsanne, basically. That is what this wine is. This is the 04, so that was bottled last June. So it's been in bottle almost a year. And this is the vintage that's currently out in the market. Then we have the single varieties, Grenache Blanc, which has turned out to be for us, a very successful variety. We actually put a little bit on the market as a single varietal. This is, again, the 04 vintage of Grenache Blanc. As I guess it was Deborah who said, you couldn't, from the DNA footprint, you couldn't tell red from white Grenache. And when they're out in the vineyard, until the grapes go on the vine, you cannot tell by looking at looking at them, which is the red and which is the white. They're identical. And they're very similar in their maintenance of acidity as they ripen, and also similar in the fact that they tend to be rather high sugars. So this ends up, Grenache Blanc ends up being harvested at 26 or maybe even 26 and a half bricks. So often it runs 15 plus alcohol. I think this wine is like 15.3. I didn't look at the bottle recently, but it's something along that line. But it covers the alcohol quite well. It has enough guts to it so that it doesn't, to me anyhow, it doesn't taste hot. Then the next variety is the Picpoul Blanc. This is a barrel sample of 05. 04 we got rather badly frosted in the Picpoul and didn't have enough to hold out, so I just pulled an 05 barrel sample. That wine was just actually bottled last week, but the sample came from before bottling. What do you think about that? It's turned out, I mean, we were really surprised. It comes in with almost perfect numbers. Nice acid when it's ripe, not quite as high sugars as the Grenache, so that it's ripe at about 24 and maintains its acidity and has this nice sort of gingery character to it. I think that's a real discovery, and I think that's one of the reasons we're bringing in all the rest of the minor grapes of Châteauneuf-du-Pape, because I think in France often there are, because of the weather and variation of the vintage, it's difficult to ripen some of these grapes, and they tend to be acid. Whereas our problem in California is often that they get too ripe. So maybe it's entirely possible that grapes that don't work quite so well in France might be perfect for us here. And the only way we're going to find out is by trying it. You can't do it by measuring bunch size or berry size or skin to juice or all that stuff. You got to put them in the field and harvest the grapes and make the wine. That's the only way you can tell. And the next wine is the Roussanne 04. So this was already bottled wine, officially bottled. Roussanne is our largest planting of white grapes. We have about 15 or 16 acres of Roussanne out there. And it is as in Beaucastel, it is basically our lead grape for our white wine. Our Esprit de Beaucastel, which is our flagship white. Has similar characteristics to what you tasted. We're dealing with young vines. I hope when they get older, we'll be able to get the depth that you tasted in the Beaucastel. The Roussan? The oldest were planted in 96, 97. So the oldest are about 10 years old. And they were our early planting, and the youngest of our Roussans were planted in 2000. So you're dealing with still fairly, certainly by Beaucastel standards, very young vines. The first red is Mourvedre. This is the 03 vintage. It was bottled about a year ago. We do, when we originally started Tablas Creek, our thought was to do a la Beaucastel, one red wine and one white wine, basically both blends. But, I mean, with the realities of market and marketing here, we recognized that we had to break out of that pattern a little bit. So then we did a more approachable, somewhat less expensive blend of both red and white, which we called Côte de Tablas. And then in order to sort of showcase the grape varieties that went to make up these blends, we put about 300 or 400 cases a year of the Mourvedre, the Syrah, the Roussan, and the Grenache Blanc on the market mostly starting last year. So this was the first varietal we released, and as I say, there were about 400 cases released in the United States. And this is our lead red grape. Again, we have about 14 or 15 acres of this planted. Actually, our oldest planting, 95, was when the first Mourvedre went in. And actually, if I'm not mistaken, when we had a threatened frost, Dick and Deborah were putting hot caps over the top of the young vines. Yeah. Again, we don't get the same depth that Francois gets with his old vines, but to me, the Mourvedre, even from the youngish vines here, has a sort of a juiciness and ripe tannins that makes it very, very attractive. And we're making California wines here in California. We're making Paso Robles, or we're making Tablas Creek wines. We're inspired by Beaucastel, but we're not trying to make Beaucastel. And the next red is a Syrah. This is also the 03. It's typically dark color. One other thing, of course, is that we don't use a lot of wood. We use a lot of wood, but not a lot of new wood. And these wines are aged in as much as we can in 1,200-gallon foudres, 45 hectoliters. They do, so it doesn't put them in stainless, so that where they're enclosed, but they can still oxygenate, but at a lower rate, and of course they absorb more wood, when they're in the fooders. And the fooders, of course, we expect to last 25 or 30 years. And in order to keep them clean and free of contamination, we make sure we keep them full. And when we do clean them, we do it with steam and ozonated water. So we want to avoid any kind of contamination of particularly Brettanomyces, which somebody was talking about earlier, that can get into the wood and is hard to get out. And we of course avoid use of any now with we avoid use of chlorine totally in the winery these days. It's not allowed in. And the next wine is a barrel sample of Grenache Oh Five. It's a barrel sample, but it's a finished wine. I think that the resemblance of the varietals is quite clear here. They're different. The California wines have a different sort of fruitiness to them, but it seems to me that as you taste through these three, you recognize the same varieties that Francois was showing earlier. And the next wine is another barrel sample. It's the Oh Five Kun Wazza, which is a grape that we're asked about. How come Kun Wazza? Well, taste it and then see what you think. It's like sticking your nose in a glass of framboise. It just has that raspberry character to it. It's just so bright. And as a blending component, even 5% changes a blend. And on Francois' advice, we brought this in instead of Cinsault. As he said earlier, Syrah and Mourvèdre tend to be reducing grapes, and they need something to open them up. And both Grenache and Kun Wazza serve that function. And they have different characters. Grenache seems to be the more cherry, Kun Wazza is more raspberry, but they do open up the Mourvèdre and the Syrah. Then the next, now if you have, I don't know how yours were poured, mine were poured somewhat differently, but I'm going to go, if you have a white and a red next, we're going to taste the red before the white. We're going to finish on the white. So the red is the '03 Esprit de Beaucastel, and that is, wait a minute, let's see, yeah, right, and that is 50% Mourvèdre and 27% Syrah, 16% Grenache, and 7% Kun Wazza. This has been in bottle, would have been bottle 05. It's been in bottle about 6 months, no longer. '03, let's see, we're about to bottle, in July we'll be bottling the '04, so it was about July of '03, yeah. Couldn't have been. This is what are we, '06, '04. So it was bottled in about July of 1904. So it's been in bottle about 10 months. This is the vintage that's currently out on the market. And then the last wine is our flagship white, which is Esprit de Beaucastel Blanc. It's the '04 vintage. And it's 65% Roussanne, 30% Grenache Blanc, and 5% Picpoul. And that's all she wrote. If there are any questions, I'll be glad to. I'll be glad to answer them. Yes. They're 100%, yeah. Yeah, the single varieties are 100%. Yes. Yeah, they're drip. Irrigated as little as possible. Only when it gets to a point where the vine is, looking really unhappy, that we do irrigate. And when we do irrigate, we tend to irrigate like for 24 hours rather than irrigate frequently, because we want the water to go down and the roots to chase it down there, not to spread out. Yes. Yes, yes, it's the same clones that are being offered other growers through Nova Vines, yes. Any other questions? Yes.
Bob, which of the cultivars do you see as your problem child, and which do you see as
I think what the problem child, if there is one, is the Grenache Noir. Not to grow, for heaven's sake. It tends to be vigorous. It's really happy out there. And the French clones that we brought in do not shatter the way a lot of clones that had been planted here before shatter. So we have to thin. We try not to exceed 3 tons an acre. We cut it down to 10 or 12 bunches of vine on all the red wines, and on the whites, if we get 3.5. We'll average a little less than 3 tons an acre over the entire vineyard for any vintage. So but I think Grenache will be a real star in the future. I love it. I think that it has some great characteristics. It gets ripe beautifully, although at a little high sugars. It has delicious fruit. It is just a very attractive grape. I think it's been under-recognized and under-planted here in California. I think and hope that we'll see a lot more Grenache. Mourvèdre is the grape that we, I guess, considered would be our star. I'd say Mourvèdre, Grenache are the 2 grapes, I think as they are at Beaucastel, that are the star, that will be the base of our Esprit de Beaucastel, our flagship wine. I think Grenache needs a little more age in the ground for the vine, to get a little more depth. But I think those two, Grenache and Mourvèdre, will be the real stars of the reds. In the whites, we like Roussanne a lot, and that's our biggest planting. And I think Grenache Blanc has turned out to be an extremely good variety. And I think Picpoul will figure in there somewhere as we see it. Marsanne, we're sort of phasing out a little bit. It makes a good element for the Côte de Tablas. It's a nice producer, and it is fairly even, and it has it's a nice nutty character to it, but it's a good foil for the Viognier that goes in that blend. So we think that Marsanne will be hanging around. And otherwise, I think in the whites, Roussanne, Grenache Blanc, and in the reds, Mourvèdre and Grenache Noir. That's what I look forward to as being the base. Yes? The oak program for your white wines. I'm sorry? The oak program? Let's see. Roussanne is fermented about 50% or maybe 40% in stainless, and 60% in wood. Some new wood. When we introduce new barrels, maybe as much as 10% new wood. But actually, this is what, the 04 we tasted. Actually, we fermented the 04 Roussanne in a foudre. We had in a new foudre, and we didn't want to put the reds into it right away, so we used it to ferment a part of the 04 Roussanne that you tasted here. So it's some small barrels, some stainless, but not a lot of new barrels. Okay.